Welcome to Chapter 26. This is all about seed plants. So this chapter continues our study of plants by examining the seed plants or the seed-bearing plants. Now, development of seeds was a major evolutionary advancement which allowed plants to move further away from the water because they didn't have a need for water because they did not produce swimming sperm. So they became the most successful class of plants and certainly one of the most successful and diverse group of terrestrial organisms. They're second only to the insects. So seed-bearing plants include everything that you might think of when you hear the word plant. Fruit trees and pine trees and rose bushes, dogwoods, our state flower, banana trees, bamboo, pecan trees, wheat and corn and the grass in your front yard are all examples of seed-bearing plants. Now, seed plants play an integral role in all aspects of life on the planet, shaping the physical terrain, influencing climate, and maintaining life as we know it. And for thousands of years, humans have depended on seed-bearing plants for nutrition and medical components. Seed plants also serve as a source of manufactured products like timber for shelter, paper, dyes, and textiles for clothing. So our objectives in this chapter describe the two major innovations that allowed seed plants to reproduce in the absence of water, discuss the purpose of pollen grains and seeds, describe the significance of angiosperms bearing both flowers and fruit, discuss the type of seeds produced by gymnosperms, list the four groups of extant gymnosperms and give examples of each, describe the life cycle of a typical gymnosperm, explain why angiosperms are the dominant form of plant life today, describe the main parts of a flower and their functions, describe the life cycle of a typical angiosperm, and compare and contrast the two main groups of flowering plants. Okay, so here we go. Now, I just put this up here. You've seen it before, and I just wanted to remind you where we came from and where we're going. You remember that we began with the charophytes looking at specifically green algae, and that was a photosynthetic organism that lived in the water, was dependent upon the water, but they gave rise to the non-vascular seedless plants. We call them the bryophytes, and we looked at the mosses as a typical example of bryophytes. Now, the non-vascular seedless plants then gave rise to the vascular seedless plants. We looked at ferns as our example of a typical vascular seedless plant. But as we move forward evolutionarily, right, we went from non-vascular to vascular. So the development of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, was a major evolutionary advancement that allowed plants, seedless plants, to move further away from the water. We looked at ferns. Ferns still need a close source of water, or at least moisture in their environment in order to reproduce. But the vascular seedless plants gave rise to the seed plants, or the seed-bearing plants. We'll call them spermatophytes, and there are two main groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Just want to remind you here, you've seen this before, alternation of generations. And once again, so we saw alternation of generations in algae and in the mosses, and in the ferns we're also going to see alternation of generations here in the sporophytes. Okay, so just a brief review. Recall that charophytes and green algae gave rise to the bryophytes, the seedless non-vascular, and our example was the moss. The bryophytes gave rise to the pterophytes. We looked at Those are the seedless vascular plants. We looked at the ferns. The pterophytes gave rise to the spermatophytes. Now, that's what we're talking about in this chapter, the vascular seed-bearing plants. And you'll recall, too, that algae, mosses, and ferns all require water, at least the presence of some water for reproduction, because their sperm must swim to the ovum in order for fertilization to occur. The spermatophytes, however, advanced beyond the need for water as a necessary ingredient for fertilization. So the dominant generation for the spermatophytes, the seed-bearing plants, is the sporophyte. Now, if you go outside, look out the window, or you go outside, walk through the woods, anything that you see from grass and pine trees and any flower that you see, those are all sporophytes. Now, in spermatophytes, the gametophyte is not a separate structure, as we saw in the mosses. It's been reduced to a bundle of microscopic cells that produce the gametes. Now, those cells are tucked within structures on the spermatophytes. So that means the spermatophytes are heterospores or heterosporous. They make two types of spores on the same plant, namely megaspores, which develop into the female gametophytes and will yield ova, and microspores, which develop into the male gametophytes and will yield sperm. Now, pollen, as we'll talk about later on, pollen is the bundle of microspores that develop into sperm. So pollen is a male structure, okay? And seeds, fertilized ova will eventually become a seed, is an embryo surrounded by nutritional cells. We call those endosperm, as we'll see. And that develops within the ovary of the plant. Remember, ovary archegonium, okay? So let's talk pollen. You're all familiar with pollen, and especially at this time of year, pollen is starting to kind of blow around, and it's that stuff that covers your car and covers your walkways and covers your deck and turns everything green, and we hate it, and it makes us sneeze. But it's very important, and it's actually quite a fascinating structure. But pollen grains, those are the little tiny packets of sperm, essentially. Remember, they are 1N, and they are produced in the anthers. Remember Antleridia? Antleridia and the antlers, those are male structures. So pollen are the result of the male structures, but essentially they're tiny packets of sperm, and you know that sperm are 1N. That's important to remember when we think about alternation of generations. Pollen is distributed by the wind, water, and certainly animal pollinators. We can see this is a microscopic view. Of course, these are enhanced, color enhanced. These aren't the actual colors of pollen, but you can see that pollen comes in many different sizes and different shapes, and some have little spikes on them, like little Velcro coverings, and some of them are smooth. But this is a microscopic picture of various pollen grains. And pollen grains develop on the anthers. So here we see the filament, and these are the anthers, and you can see pollen grains here, and they're distributed by wind, water, and animal pollinators. And you can see here this poor bee just covered with pollen grains. Now, pollen is protected from desiccation. Remember, that's drying out. We don't have a source of water here, or we don't need a source of water here, but they're protected from drying out by a tough outer layer called the exine. And the pollen grain, once it lands onto the female structure of the plant, it forms a pollen tube. So it actually has two nuclei, which we'll see in a little while. And one of them is called the tube nucleus, which forms the pollen tube, which then carries the sperm to the ovum, and that's how fertilization occurs. Okay, so the pollen tube is a long channel that forms between the pollen grain and the ovum. And remember, the pollen tube forms down through the style of the pistil because the ovum, the egg, is down in the ovary. Okay, so here you see the pollen grain and you see all of its parts, and I'm not interested that you remember all of these parts, but there are two nuclei within the pollen grain, and one of them is referred to as the tube nucleus and the other is the generative nucleus. Now, the tube nucleus obviously is going to generate the tube, right? It's going to propagate the tube. So it's called the tube nucleus. The generative nucleus eventually will divide and form the two sperm cells. So here we see the tube nucleus leading the way, forming the tube. Here it is forming, here it is getting longer and longer. Eventually the end of the pollen tube is going to reach the ovum within the ovary, and during the way the generative nucleus is going to divide into two cells, and those are going to be sperm cells. And once the pollen tube reaches the ovum, then that will fuse and the two sperm cells will be released into the ovum. Okay, so there are two nuclei. The tube nucleus forms the tube, the generative nucleus forms the sperm, and the tube carries the sperm to the ovum so fertilization can occur, right? And so here is a micrograph of a pollen tube, and you can see the pollen grain here and the formation of the tube going on there. And this would be the tube nucleus there. And back here, it's kind of hidden behind the structure, but that is the generative nucleus. And once the tube nucleus again reaches the ovum, then the generative nucleus will make its way down the tube, subsequently dividing into the two sperm cells. All right, let's go to the first video about pollen. This is from Science Magazine. Not very long, pretty cool to watch. You don't have to learn anything here, but it's very interesting. And we go to a quick check. Which of the following helped spermatophytes conquer the land? Your choices are leaves and spores, spores and radicals, radicals and pollen, pollen and seeds. Well, we haven't talked much about seeds yet, but leaves certainly not, because we saw that ferns and mosses have leaves and they needed water, so that didn't help them conquer the land. So that's not good. Spores, well, in a sense, right? Because even in spermatophytes, we make microspores and megaspores. Radicals, remember, are those little finger-like, kind of root-like structures of mosses that help moss to cling on to the substrate, be it soil or rock or dead wood. But remember, they don't go very long. They don't grow into the substrate very long. And so that's why it's very easy to just peel up a mat of moss. So radicals wouldn't help organisms conquer the land. And if radicals is not correct, then certainly C is not correct. We just talked about pollen, and that certainly did help spermatophytes conquer the land. And we're talking about seed-bearing plants, so that must be the correct answer, even though we haven't talked about seeds yet. Okay, let's talk about seeds. So seeds are an embryo. So now this is an embryo, right? So it's a fertilized egg. The sperm has already fused with the ovum to make the zygote, and then the zygote starts dividing. It becomes the embryo surrounded by nutritional tissue, and we call that the endosperm. Now, do you enjoy eating corn on the cob or corn off the cob? Well, you're eating, did you know, you're eating embryos. You're eating corn embryos. Embryos develop into the new plant, the sporophyte, and they're surrounded by a seed coat that protects them from desiccation. So, you know, just dried corn here. You're familiar with dried corn. And certainly if you plant a garden, or you have in the past helped your parents or grandparents plant a garden, you know those corn seeds, those dried corn seeds, are really tough. They're really hard. That's the seed coat that is protecting the embryo from drying out. And it can protect those embryos for many, many years, thousands of years. I mean, there are seeds from 1,000 years ago that have been germinated. So that seed coat really does a job well. And we'll talk about cotyledons. Cotyledons are germ leaves, and there's two types of seed plants. One is the monocot, that's or monocotyledon. We call it monocot for short. That means they have one germ leaf, cotyledon, or dicotyledons. We call them dicots for short. They have two cotyledons. So here are bean seeds, and bean, you don't know this yet, but these beans, these lima beans, have two cotyledons. So this is a dicot. Corn, by the way, has one germ leaf, so it's a monocot. And in fact, when I teach this class, teach the lab of this class in real life, in the actual lab, we germinate corn to see its root structure and its germ leaf, and its first cotyledon, and we germinate lima bean seeds to see its root structure, because root structures of dicots and monocots are different, and to see the two cotyledons. Okay, so here's just generally seed anatomy. Here's the bean that we looked at. Seed coat is that hard outer coating that protects the embryo inside. We can see the embryo here and the embryo there. And we can see the germ leaf, one cotyledon here in the corn. We see two cotyledons here. And if you take a bean and you split it down the middle, there's a cotyledon on one side, a cotyledon on the other. That's your dicot. And there's your endosperm. And actually the cotyledons in a dicot actually are part of the endosperm, part of the nutritional element that feeds the embryo. There's your seed coat and your endosperm there. Cotyledons, we have one there. That's a monocot. We have two there. That's your dicot. Okay. Okay, and here's just a germination picture showing the germination of a monocot. This is corn. And there's your one cotyledon. And here's your dicot. This is your bean. And you see one cotyledon there. You can kind of see it there, and the other one tucked behind it, or your germ leaves. You can see the root structure here. It varies. I mean, it's different between monocots and dicots. We'll talk about that later. And the little brown shell that you see sort of popping off there, that's the seed coat. That's cotyledon. That's a cotyledon. And Sir David Attenborough, greatest naturalist in history, I think. This is from BBC Earth. It gives a lesson on seeds. It's about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes long, and but it's very interesting, this video on seeds. Take a look. Okay, evolution of seed plants. Okay, so I don't want you necessarily to remember all this, but I want to put everything into perspective. So we had the bryophytes, like the mosses, evolving from, remember, green algae around 500 million years ago. This is million years ago, these numbers. They gave rise to the pterophytes. We looked at the ferns. Pterophytes rose about between 400 and 350 or so million years ago. They gave rise to the gymnosperms. Now, gymnosperms, these are your cone-bearing plants. You know them as pine trees and hemlocks and sycamores and, okay, all of those kinds of plants. They showed up around 300 or so million years ago. And then the angiosperms, now these are the two groups of seed-bearing plants we're going to be talking about, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The angiosperms, we call them the flowering plants. Any plant that you see out there that bears a flower, that's an angiosperm. But look, there was, for the longest time, gymnosperms were the dominant plant life on the planet. And it took about 300 million more years or so before the flowering plants showed up. So for the longest time, everything was pine tree and hemlock tree and all those kinds of trees. Okay, let's talk about the gymnosperms first. Gymnosperms are the first seed-bearing plants to appear about 300 million years ago. Gymnosperms produce cones. Now, cones are, I call them seed pods. This is my terminology here. Seed pods, and you have cones on like pines and hemlocks, junipers, cedars. You can name 100 more, I'm sure. But any tree out there that you see that has a cone on it, like a pine tree with pine cones, that is a gymnosperm. Where does that come from? Well, gymnosperms produce naked seeds. Naked seeds, that's what the word means. So gymno, or gym, is Greek, and so gymnosperm comes from the Greek word that means naked. And I've already told you that gymnosperms produce naked seeds. So that's where that word comes from, okay? So gymnosperms, anything like pine trees or such, they make these cones. You're familiar with pine cones. I call them seed pods, and I'll explain why in a minute. But they produce naked seeds, and that comes from the ancient Greek. Oh, reason I'm showing you this image, because if you look at images, you can just Google images of ancient Greek pottery, and many times you'll see images of naked men doing sports activities. Well, a long story short, but this will help you remember. Back in the day, ancient Greece I'm talking about, men used to go to places to do sport and to do physical activity like wrestle and run and jump and throw things. But they would do those activities naked. And so the word gym means naked, and that's where the word gymnasium comes from, because in ancient Greece, men would go to these places, they called them gymnasiums, they would get naked and they would do their sports activities. So that's where gymnosperms comes from, naked seeds. Now you'll forever remember that. Okay, gymnosperms produce naked seeds. That means they have no seed coat. Seeds are not enclosed in an ovary, which we will see in the angiosperms. Separate male and female gametophytes. The cones occur for most gymnosperms. There are a few exceptions, but for most gymnosperms, the cones occur on the same plant. So this time of year, you can go outside. I have a big pine tree right outside my house here, but if you're on campus, Richard Bland campus, just go out in they have these huge pine trees out there. And you can see both male and female cones on the same plant. I'll show you the difference in a minute. Pollination is by wind and some insects. Now, tracheids are the cells in xylem that transport water and nutrients. You already know that. And the sporophylls are modified leaves. Okay, sporophylls, that's just another name for the cones. And these modified leaves, the cones, protect the seeds. Gymnosperms thrive where there is no water part of the year. I give you an example of taiga, but think about the gymnosperms just in Virginia, right? In the winter, they stay green, they never lose their leaves, they still do their thing, and they kind of get a jump start on spring by producing pollen and seeds, whereas the angiosperms, as we'll see later, have to wait until there's lots of sun and the weather is warm and it starts to rain. Okay, gymnosperms are evergreen. They do not lose. Sorry about that. Gymnosperms are evergreen. They do not lose their leaves, and their leaves are needle-like. They don't lose their leaves. They're evergreen, so they conduct photosynthesis all year round, and they're able to not only survive but thrive in cold, dry weather or cold, dry biomes. And again, life cycle, alternation of generations always. So what about those naked seeds? Well, naked seeds have no seed coat. Here you see a couple of pine cones or cones. And some of the seeds that have popped out. Now these are pine seeds, or sometimes we call them pine nuts. These aren't the pine nuts that you eat, but they have little wings on them, which means they're able. Your book refers to them as scales, but they're able to, as they loosen from the female cone. These are female cones. Then the wind catches them and blows them all around. I was just outside today and I found a little winged seed from my pine tree across the street in my backyard. So the wind blows them around, and also animals disperse them as well. So piñones are the pine nuts that maybe you're familiar with. Maybe you cook with them, or your mother cooks with them, or you put them on your salad. You can eat them, pine nuts. They come from the pinyon pine. It's still the same thing. This is the seed. This is the naked seed that came out of the cone, just like these little seeds over here. Except the seeds from Virginia pines, loblolly pines, the pines around here, you can't eat. But these seeds are big enough that you can eat them. Okay, so cones, male and female cones, grow on the same plant with regard to pine trees, for instance, and most gymnosperms. Staminate cones are male cones. They produce gametophytes, which produce pollen. And pollen, as I said, is just think of them as packets of sperm. Now, these are the little squiggly male cones. The male cones are very much smaller. This is where the pollen comes from. And then after the pollen falls, after we go through the pollen season, these little things will dry up and fall off. And in my case, in my neighborhood, you find them all over the street, all over the yard. And when I was a kid, after these things fell to the ground and then we would have a rain, these things would get wet, and I would pick them up and throw them at my sister and tell her they were worms, and she'd go screaming to Mom, 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 Johnny's doing worms on me. Anyway, those are male cones, staminate cones. And then we have ovulate cones that produce ova. Right? These are the female gametophytes, and these are the big prickly cones that you find on pine trees, or if you go out into the woods, you find them on the ground all over the place. And so in this actually illustration, you can see the ovulate cones, the female cones, and the staminate cones, the male cones back there. Cool. Okay, gymnosperm life cycle, alternation of generations. Always, always, always alternation of generations. That means you're going to go from sporophyte to gametophyte back to sporophyte, or 2N to 1N back to 2N. So here we see the pine tree, the sporophyte, that's 2N. And the sporophyte is going to generate ovulate cones, female cones, and the staminate cones, the male cones. And the female cones are going to produce ova, which are eggs, which are 1N. And the male cones are going to produce pollen, which essentially is sperm. Sperm is 1N. And there you see the scale and the seed in here. So these are 1N structures. And but once they get fertilized, there's the little pollen and the pollen tube, and fertilization occurs. Now you're back to 2N, and you're back to a seed, right? The pollen fertilizes the ovum, and that generates the zygote, and the zygote becomes the embryo, and now you have the seed. Now these are naked seeds in the case of gymnosperms, and they are dispersed, it says, and grow into mature trees. So if you plant one of those piñones, if it's not been processed, then you'll grow a new little tree. All right, so sporophyte 2N generates gametophytes, which are 1N. Remember, gametophytes make gametes, so gametophytes are always 1N. Fertilization occurs, pollen is 1N, sperm is 1N, ovum is 1N, so now you're back to a zygote, which is 2N, and zygotes develop into seeds, and germination of seeds produce new sporophytes. All right, and that you're back to 2N generation. All right, here is gymnosperm life cycle by Nature Clearly, and it will clearly explain the life cycle of gymnosperms. See you in a minute. And we have another quick check here. At what stage in the life cycle of a gymnosperm does the diploid zygote form? Think about it as I show you your choices. When the pollen tube begins to grow, when the seed germinates, when the ovulate cone drops from the tree, at fertilization. Now, recall from 101 and from chapter 25, where does the zygote come from? Remember, zygote is 2N, right? Zygote is a sperm fusing with an ovum or fusing with an egg. That is a zygote. And when sperm fuses with egg, the process is fertilization. So a zygote is always the result of fertilization. The first step after fertilization is a zygote. Okay, angiosperms. Angiosperms, we call them flowering plants because, well, they make flowers. But however, some angiosperms, like grass, for instance, you don't, depending on the variety of grass, you rarely see the flower. But there is a flower there. Flowering plants, they showed up about 135 million years ago in the early Cretaceous. You don't have to remember that. They're the most diverse plant species, certainly, on the planet. More than 300,000 species. I think your book says 250,000, but it's more than that. It's actually more than 300,000 now. And their diversity is only second to the insects. So that makes them certainly the dominant plant group. And so here you see one species of the most diverse plant group together with one member of the most diverse animal group. Did Jeffries do that on purpose? And success in terrestrial ecosystems are due to flowers and fruit. Here we see apples as our example of fruit. So flowers, not just for Mother's Day anymore, flowers are modified leaves. And they're extremely diverse in color, shape, and size, as you know. All flowers are structurally similar. They have a peduncle, sepals, petals, pistils, and stamens. We'll look at those structures, each one of those structures individually in a minute, but brief description, the peduncle is the part that attaches the flower to the stem. Sepals are attached to the peduncle. Now, when, for instance, when a rose bud first appears, it's covered in green. Those green leaf-like structures, those are the sepals. They protect the bud, and eventually they will, as the bud opens, they kind of fold back and they'll sort of dry up and be useless. But and they're leaf-like, but initially they're photosynthetic. They're green, right? So they have chlorophyll, so they do photosynthesis. All right, petals vary in size, color, shape, aroma, and they are designed to attract pollinators of various types, flies and bees and butterflies and moths and bats and hummingbirds and all different kinds of pollinators. Now, you have the gynoecium, which is the female structure of the flower. Okay, it consists of, well, we call them pistils. And a pistil is made up of a stigma, a style, and an ovary. And that ovary produces ova, which of course, as you know now, are eggs. And then you have the androecium, which is the male structure. And by the way, these are on the same flowers. And the male structure, we call them stamens. Stamens consist of a filament and anthers, and they produce pollen, which, as I've said, are just little packets of sperm. So pistils and stamens. Okay, so remember, stamens are male structures, and you see them here. Okay, stamens are filaments. Here's a filament there. I think I have it marked for you. That's the anther, and there's the filament. Okay, we're sort of looking down on them, so you see a foreshortened view of the filament, but they're long. This is part of the pistil here, part of the female structure. But these are anthers, which generate the pollen grains, and they're connected to the flower proper by their filaments. All right, and here we see pistils. So this is part of the pistil here. Again, foreshortened. In this view, you see it a little bit better. There's your pistil. This is female. From here to there, of course, we don't see the ovary. But part of the pistil, we have this stigma, which is this sort of bulbous end. It's kind of sticky, right? It's designed to catch pollen. And then we have this long structure here, which is actually a tube, and that's called the style. We'll see the importance of that here shortly. Okay, flower anatomy. Let me pop these. So perfect flowers contain both the gynoecium and the androecium, so both female and male parts, both pistils and stamens. And so here we see it here. Here's the flower, and in our real live lab, we actually dissect flowers, and we look at these under the dissecting scope, and you can actually see the ova in here, and you can see the pollen grains. But these are the anthers, androecium. We just call them stamen. There's the filament. You can see the filament here in the enlargement, and the anther here with the pollen grains inside. Microsporangia. These are males. And here we see the pistil. This whole thing is pistil. They call them carpels here, one is a pistil, multiples are carpels. Your book likes carpels. But this is a pistil. The gynoecium consists of the stigma. This is this bulbous end. It's sticky to catch the pollen, and the style, which is hollow in it, to allow the sperm to the pollen tube to go down through. And then the ovary down here has the eggs, the megasporangia, that will eventually make seeds. So some flowers have more than one carpel, and so we call that the pistil. Some have more than one. Just stick with pistil and you'll be happy. And but all flowers have more than one stamen. So most flowers that you're going to be familiar with have one pistil, but multiple stamen. Okay, so in this video by Professor Dave, he explains angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. I think it's about 11 minutes long, but I love Professor Dave. I hope you do too. You've seen his videos before. Check it out. Quick check. Which of the following statements about flowers is true? Check all that apply. Your choices are: a pistil contains a stigma, style, and ovary. The anther contains pollen grains. Flowers are modified leaves that attract pollinating animals. And a perfect flower contains both a gynoecium and an androecium. Let's take them one at a time. A pistil, that's the female structure, consists of a stigma, style, and ovary. Well, the stigma, remember, is sort of the bulbous, sticky part at the top. The style is the long tubular structure that connects the stigma to the ovary, where the ovum are, so that's certainly true. The anther contains pollen grains. Anther, the antler, is the male structure that contains pollen grains. Certainly that is true. Flowers are modified leaves that attract pollinating insects. Well, I've already told you they're modified leaves, and you know that they attract pollinating animals, so that's certainly true. And a perfect flower contains both female and male parts, and that certainly is true. Okay, that crash you heard, I just busted my mouse. Okay, the angiosperm life cycle. We looked at the gymnosperm life cycle. Here's the angiosperm life cycle. Alternation of generations. Sporophyte to gametophyte. Gametophyte back to sporophyte. 2N to 1N. 1N back to fertilization. Back to 2N. There's a little bit of a difference here because we have two fertilization events. So the sporophyte here, that's a plant with your flower, is 2N, of course, and it generates the gametophytes, the pistils, and the stamen. Both male and female gametophytes generated off of the same sporophyte. And from the stamen come sperm, pollen grains which contain sperm, and from the pistil come the eggs or the ova. And so the first fertilization event is when the sperm fuses with the ovum. In order for that to happen, the pollen tube has to form, and then the two little sperm cells, which remember are generated from the generative cell. The generative cell divides and you get two little sperm out of it, and those sperm go through the pollen tube up into the ovary, and one of those sperm will fuse with one of the polar nuclei in the ovum. That will make the zygote. That's the first fertilization event, We make the zygote. So we're already back to 2n, and the zygote will start to divide and become the embryo. You see it, okay, the embryo there in yellow. And then the second fertilization event occurs where you have the other sperm nucleus fusing with actually there are three polar nuclei. One gets fertilized and becomes the zygote, and the other two fuse with the other sperm nucleus. So you get this nuclear structure that then becomes the endosperm. See the endosperm up there, and then the seed is the embryo plus the endosperm. And in angiosperms, you get the seed coat, little hard shell that forms around the seed that protects it for many, many years. And when that seed germinates, you get the new seed germinates, you get the new sporophyte, and you're back to 2n. All right? Important to remember, I mean, alternation of generations, 2n to 1n back to 2n, you know that. Sporophyte to gametophyte back to sporophyte, you know that. Important to remember about angiosperms is the first fertilization event generates the embryo, and the second fertilization event generates the endosperm, which is necessary to allow the embryo to survive for many, many years. Okay, here is by Peter Klappa, a short little video describing the double fertilization event in angiosperms. Check it out. Tutti-frutti. For those of you who don't know, that's a Seinfeld reference. We're talking about fruit here, in other words. So fruit are ovaries within which seeds, remember seeds are embryos, develop. Ovaries enlarge as the seeds grow. So here you see a papaya. It's just a big embryo. And inside of the embryo you see, it's just a big ovary, sorry. And inside of the ovary you see all of these little embryos. Those are the seeds. So did you know when you eat an apple or a peach that you're eating an ovary? Yeah. That's what fruit is. It's an ovary. And so there are two types of fruits. There's fleshy fruits and there's dry fruits. And their fleshy fruits come in a whole variety of shapes and forms and colors that you're familiar with, like apples and oranges. There's watermelons, and here's mangoes. Here's some grapes over here, berries. There's bananas, which are fleshy. Okay, those are fleshy fruits. And then you have dry fruits, which are your nuts and grains like wheat, and certainly rice is included in that dry fruit category. And however, many vegetables, many things that we call vegetables are actually technically fruits. Remember, fruits are ovaries with embryos inside. Fruits are large structures with seeds inside. And so I think everybody is familiar with the idea that tomatoes, right? The big thing is I want a vegetable salad, put tomatoes in there. But tomatoes aren't vegetables, they're fruits, right? Everybody knows that. Little tongue-in-cheek deal. And they are fruits because they're an ovary with embryos inside. But so are eggplants. There's eggplants there. Here's a avocado. You can see its large embryo there. These are zucchini, but cucumbers the same way. I put cucumbers up here, but these are zucchini. But same thing, long ovaries with lots of embryos inside, lots of seeds inside, and I think your book mentions like bell peppers, jalapeno peppers, those things. Those are also fruits, technically fruits. Okay, angiosperm diversity. Real quick, like we have basal angiosperms. Now, basal means like at the bottom, at like everything stems from the base, right? Basal angiosperms are ancient, archaic angiosperms. We have some archaic angiosperms that are extant. We have extant examples of archaic angiosperms, living examples, like Magnolia is a penultimate example of an archaic or basal angiosperm. They're similar to both gymnosperms and angiosperms. The idea here is that uh, these basal angiosperms gave rise to both gymnosperms and angiosperms proper. That's just a theory, though, at this point, so not to remember. But basal angiosperms are evergreen. They produce both flowers and cone-like structures, and a great example is your magnolia. I'll show you pictures in a minute. Monocots, as you know now, they're called monocots because they have one cotyledon, one germ leaf. Their leaves have parallel veins, and interestingly, their flower parts, you'll see, are in threes or in multiples of threes. 3, 6, 9. If you see a flower with three petals or 6 petals, then those are going to be monocots. They have a fibrous, multi kind of bundle of roots. It looks like there's no rhyme or reason to the root structure. Their vascular tissue is scattered in the stem, and monocots include grass, like in your front yard, corn, grains like wheat and barley, bamboo, sugarcane. Bananas are also monocots. And then you have dicots, so-called, because they have 2 cotyledons, 2 germ leaves. Their developed leaves have branched veins or reticulated veins. You'll see that in a minute. Their flower parts are in 4s or 5s or multiples. So if you see a flower that has 5 petals, that's a dicot, or 10 petals, that's a dicot. They have their root structure has a central tap root that grows really way deep into the ground, and that's why you can have an 80-foot oak tree that doesn't get blown over in the wind because it has a very long tap root, and then it has accessory roots coming off of that. Vascular tissue forms a ring in the stem. We'll see that. I'll show you the picture. So vascular tissue is scattered in monocots. Vascular tissue forms a nice geometric ring in the stems of dicots. 2/3 of your angiosperms are dicots, so just about everything that you see out there is going to be dicot. All of your fruit trees, berry bushes, oak trees, rose bushes, maple trees, grapevines, all of those things are dicots. So magnolias, right, they are evergreen all times of the year. Here we see snow on the ground, but magnolias, they do not lose their leaves. I mean, as they grow and develop, leaves will dry up and fall off. They get all over the ground. They're really messy. But the tree itself it has leaves all year round, and it's an evergreen. So there you see it in the snow. But in the spring, and certainly all summer long, these beautiful big giant white flowers will bloom on magnolias, and they produce this really wonderful sort of citrusy scent. In my neighborhood, there's lots of magnolias, and I can go walking through the neighborhood in the springtime, and you just get these as a gentle breeze blows across. You'll get this powerful scent of citrus that's coming from those magnolias. But they also produce, so they produce flowers, so that's the angiosperm part, but they also produce cones, and that's the gymnosperm part. And if you're familiar with magnolias, you've seen these cones, and as these cones develop or as seeds develop, then you'll see them pop out as these red seeds all over the place, like that. All right, that's magnolias. These are your archaic angiosperms. Now, all about monocots. Monocots, the veins in their leaves are parallel. You can see lots of veins here. These are veins going parallel. That's the central vein there. But all the other veins are parallel to it. This is corn. So that's monocots. If you go out and pick a blade of grass and hold it up to the light, you'll see parallel veins. That's a monocot. Their root structure is sort of almost looks haphazard. It just looks like a bundle of roots. They don't go very deep. And if you've done this, if you haven't, you have a chance, go out and do this. Go into a cornfield with permission. Don't break the law. And you can just pull a corn stalk right up out of the ground. One hand, you can just pull it up right up out of the ground, because there's no taproot. The roots don't go deep at all. They're just sort of just slightly below the ground. They're very superficial. So it's easy to pull these plants out of the ground. Their monocot flowers are in threes or multiples of three, so that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little petals there. So that's a monocot flower. And if that's not enough for you, you can see these kind of blade-like leaves. So you can imagine that they have parallel veins, so certainly monocot leaves there. And here's a cross-section of a monocot stem. So this would be like a cross-section of this corn right there. And these little structures, you've seen these before, but these are vascular bundles, right? Xylem and phloem bundles. And there's a large concentration on the periphery, but you can see it almost looks like they're just randomly strewn about in the center of the stem. That's a monocot stem. As we look at the dicots, we see the difference, right? Here's a typical dicot leaf. Has a central vein, and then you have these accessory veins. And then they have, if you look close, right, those veins have little veins. And even those veins have terminal veins. So you get this, we call it reticulated veining in dicot leaves. You know that's a dicot because of the veining pattern. Now their root structure consists of this very definitive central taproot, and off of the taproot you get these accessory roots, and then you get some adventitious roots off of the accessory roots, but the main thing is this central taproot is indicative of a dicot. And here we see a flower, dicot flower. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. So dicots are 4s or 5s or multiples of 4s or 5s. And we can't count them. And when I say flower parts, I mean it goes down to everything. So with these, you can see the anthers here. We can't count them. They're all jumbled together. But if you could count them, there will be 10 there, multiples of 4s or 5s. So there's 5 petals. So there's going to be 10 anthers here. And then here is the stem, typical stem of a dicot. These are your vascular bundles arranged in a nice little pattern on the periphery of the stem. There's no vascular tissue inside here. Okay, so that's a dicot stem. And lastly, this is kind of like the little chart in your book, just comparing monocots with dicots with regard to venation, flower parts, cotyledons, vascular tissue or vascular bundles, and roots. This is a good little sort of synopsis comparing dicots and monocots. You might want to look that over before the test. Okay, that is the end. Preguntas? Give me a holler. There's the question answer in the discussion board forum. Otherwise, that's the end of chapter 26. See you next time.